afternoon on this Wednesday, April 9th. I'm Yumna Naufal and these are today's headlines. Parliament approves a draft law to grant civil defense volunteers full-time employment after a group of civil defense volunteers plunged into the sea in a symbolic act of defiance. The killer of two Lebanese soldiers in an area in the northern district of Akkad commits suicide and another accomplice is caught. According to UN Human Rights Chief Navi Pillay, human rights violations by Syrian government forces far outweigh those by armed opposition groups. Parliament has approved a draft law to grant civil defense volunteers full-time employment as public sector workers across Lebanon will go on strike to pressure lawmakers to pass several crucial laws in their two-day legislative session. The bill will require volunteers to pass a series of tests before becoming full-time employees. Interior Minister Nuhad Mashnou said he opposed turning the civil defense volunteers to full-time employees, stating that there are over 3,200 volunteers and that this law stipulates turning the Civil Defense General Directorate into an almost military system that will result in high financial costs to the state. This comes after a group of civil defense volunteers gathered on Ramat al-Bayda beach, linking hands as they plunge into the sea in a symbolic act of defiance, as others demonstrated outside Parliament demanding the passage of the law. Some protesters even carried photos of a civil defense volunteer who died in the line of duty. The Future Movement-led March 14 coalition is announcing it will nominate a single candidate for the presidential election. The coalition stated that they will have one candidate in the presidential battle. The name of the candidate is yet to be announced. March 14 also is urging Hezbollah leader Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah once more to withdraw his fighters from Syria. Nasrallah has sent fighters to support Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in his war against the rebels. The killer of two Lebanese soldiers in an area in the northern district city of Akkad committed suicide overnight and another accomplice has been caught. The army is stating in a communique that Ali Hussein Talib was found dead after he committed suicide, but the military was able to arrest Bara al-Lakik after carrying out several raids in the town of Fnaida. Talib is a 30-year-old soldier who deserted from the army 3 years ago and has long been thought by his security forces. He shot himself when his uncle and two mayors from Fnaida approached him to convince him to hand himself over to the authorities. The army added that a military vehicle was ambushed by armed men riding a car in the area of Al-Kamoua. The communique also stated that the new officer was killed while another was injured during the shooting. An inquiry has been launched to determine the motive for the assault. And another group of protesters led by the Union Coordination Committee known as the UCC is holding a demonstration in Riyadh al-Sulah, joined by civil servants and teachers who are on a nationwide strike to pressure Parliament to implement the new wage scale that would increase their salaries. Speaker Nabih Biddy is calling for a meeting for the joint parliamentary committees to continue talks over the scale plan. The committees are discussing means to fund the salary increase expected to cost the government at least $1.2 billion. Mohammed Haidar, the head of the public administration employees, is urging the government to be fair and pass the salary scale draft law immediately. And the head of the Private Teachers Association, Nehmi Mahfoud, says workers would give Biddy until next week to pass the bill. Speaking at the session, MP Fouad Senoura criticized the protest held by civil servants, saying it is not possible for Parliament to legislate under such pressure. Electricité du Liban employees are also marching for the EDL headquarters in Corniche Nahed all the way to Riyadh Salah, calling on Parliament to approve a law granting raises for promotion and to promote EDL employers to a full-time position. Longtime tenants took to the street to protest a contentious rent law passed by Parliament last week. Under this law, rents regulated by the old rent law would increase over 6 years until they reach 5% of the current market value of the residence. More than 200,000 apartments, mostly in the capital, are estimated to be rented under the old law, which governs lease contracts enacted before 1992. Online military strikes against Syria will not have affected the course of the country's civil war, according to U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry. He was speaking to lawmakers in the United States before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he said the military action, ultimately abandoned by President Barack Obama at the 11th hour last year, would not have had a devastating impact on the regime of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Obama scrapped plans, just to remind you, to launch strikes against Syria after Syria's key ally Russia helped broker a deal to dismantle Damascus' chemical weapons arsenal. At the time, Kerry had argued for military strikes over a limited period against Syria, and he told the Senate on Tuesday that such a military action would only had a limited effect. Under the international agreement, brokered instead of military strikes, 54% of Syria's chemical weapons arsenal have now been removed. And human rights violations by Syrian government forces far outweigh those by armed opposition groups, according to Human Rights Chief Navi Pillay. She prompted the Syrian UN envoy to accuse her of acting like an irresponsible lunatic. Pillay briefed the 15-member UN Security Council on the human rights situation in Syria, the Central African Republic, South Sudan, Mali, and Libya. And she again called for the situation to be referred to the International Criminal Court.
Many members clearly subscribe to the idea of a political solution, so does the Secretary General. While those talks are going on, there has to be justice and accountability, and the situation in Syria should not be allowed to slip through the cracks. The Commission of Inquiry and my office, which has our own monitors, have consistently pointed to human rights violations by both sides, but you cannot compare the two. Clearly, the actions of the forces of the government far outweigh the violations, killings, cruelty, persons in detention, disappearances, far outweigh. So you cannot compare the situation. It's a government that is mostly responsible for the violations. And all these perpetrators should be identified and can, if there's a referral to the International Criminal Court.
Coming up next, a bomb kills at least 18 people after ripping through a market on the outskirts of the Pakistani capital. Stay with us for more.